Well, hello everyone. Welcome to World History video number 3, Imperialism and Resistance, Part 2. Ohio gozaimasu, it's Mr. Levy. Glad to have you all here for this second part of our review of the Newsella article we started in the last video. Before we get started, I just want to point out the cartoon that I put up today is a very famous cartoon portraying the activities of England or Great Britain during this age of imperialism. So here we've got England portrayed as an octopus, reaching out and putting their fingers into a number of countries around the world, including places like, I think this is Jamaica. I think we have Malta over here and Ireland here. So here we have a cartoon visually representing how England during this age of imperialism was using their military force and diplomacy to go out and establish dominance over other areas around the world. And that's what imperialism is all about. So hooray for that. Let's see what we're going to do today. All right. So the whole point of this video and the last video was to make sure that you got all the information you needed out of the article to answer the 3 questions I gave you. So just really quickly, that first question was about what were the reasons the age of imperialism started. And the article talked about 5 basic things: industrialization, racism, religion, nationalism, and the competitions between nations, and some technological advances in weaponry and transportation that that allowed the Europeans, Americans, and Japanese to go out and start dominating other countries. So if you have any questions about that first part of the article, you might want to rewatch that first video and reread that article to make sure that all makes sense. Today, what we're going to talk about are questions 2 and 3, which is essentially how colonized people kind of resisted, fought back against the colonizers in different ways, and also what were some of the effects it had on those people in those places during this time. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about that. So again, I'm going to go through the same process. I know it's less than ideal, but we're working with what we got. So I'm looking at the article again where we left off after that discussion of the why imperialism really began and grew. And in this short section here, collaboration and resistance. Oh, I guess I'm a little farther than I want to be. Short section here, the scramble for territory. Hopefully you can find it in the article if you're looking at it in front of you. There's a short discussion of kind of the size and the scope that we're talking about. So at this time, we learned earlier about colonization of South America, for example, by Spain and Portugal. This point in history, kind of 1850s and on, we're really looking at Europeans, Americans, and the Americans and the Japanese colonizing areas of Africa and Asia. And this part of the article just makes the point that one, the country, the nation that was the most successful at this was Great Britain. It was England. They truly were successful in using their military, specifically their navy, and their diplomats to go and establish markets and a presence in countries all around the world. And they were the dominant imperial power for much of this age of imperialism. And the actual scope of this is what the authors want to kind of give you a sense for. So this map that they have here shows the spread of British colonization during this time. And you can see all those countries in red are areas where the British had influence by the 1920s. And the saying was, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because at that time, the sun was always shining on a country where the British had influence. So a key question that the authors bring up is, okay, how could a small island country like England with relatively few people exert control over countries and people all around the world. In fact, how could any of these colonial powers do this? And they want to make us, they want to make the first point they make is on this concept called collaboration right here. So collaboration is when people work together. Um, and in this context, in the context of imperialism, collaboration involves when people in the areas that were colonized worked with the colonizers. And so this would have happened in different ways in different places in, across the board. But a lot of the motivations were because individuals might have seen that thought that there was no way to fight these technologically advanced societies that were coming in, and so they thought working with them was the best plan. They also might have saw some things of value in what they were bringing technologically or in terms of organization, etc. And so they thought, well, maybe we can figure out a way to work with them to help our own people rise up. There were a number of different reasons for collaborating, but the point was that throughout these colonized areas, in general, the colonizers had to figure out a way to collaborate with locals willing to work with them to exert their power to control the populations. The colonizers, whether they're the Europeans, Japanese, or Americans, could never have done it just on their own. They didn't have the strength. So they had to work with individuals locally to get what they wanted done. Here in this part of the article, the authors use the example of people working in India that worked with the British to set up a government to help the British rule this part of the world. So again, India is here. You guys all remember what we learned over the course of the year of the early civilizations of Mohenjo and Harappa, and how that involved those societies involved into Hindu societies and the Mughal empires after the Muslims came, et cetera, and so forth. Well, that whole area becomes colonized by the British during this age of empire. Okay, so they use the example of collaboration in the Indian context. And then they talk about how the Europeans here in this paragraph also took advantage of conflicts that already existed in a territory. They used their technological superiority to make them worse. And so they use it as an example here, again, the British in India. In India, there was already a conflict between Hindus and Muslims. And the British were able to use this conflict between people in this area to their own advantage, to kind of split them apart and make them both weaker separately than they would be if they joined together and fought against the British. So by splitting them apart, they made it easier to control them. And so this was a strategy that colonial powers often used. So here's an example of this, and then they mentioned how the telegraph and the train systems helped the colonial powers control these large areas with many people with fewer people. In this paragraph, though, right here, I want to really call out, this is where they break up kind of four key methods that local people use to resist the colonizers. And this is the central piece you want to get your head around for the answer to question 2. So here at the end of the sentence, or the end of the paragraph, they speak to the fact that while it was different in every country in every different time, 4 general patterns evolved that showed how people resisted colonizers. The first one was co-option. The second one was military resistance. The third was mysticism. And the fourth was nationalism. The authors are going to go over each of those with examples, and we're going to touch on them each, but those are the 4 things you want to highlight in answering question 2. You want to make sure your head is around them so you have an understanding of how people fought back against the imperial powers. So The first idea that they talk about is co-option. So this is where people who are ruled take take advantage of some of the things that have been used by the colonizers to dominate them and use them for their own purposes. So the first example they give is probably the most successful example, and this is Japan. Japan had been forced to open up as a country by the Americans, and at that time, they decided, you know what we're going to do? We are going to go out and we are going to learn how the Europeans industrialized, how they organized their own countries politically, how they changed their education systems, how they structured their military, how they organized their governments, and we are going to do the same thing. And the Japanese very successfully modernized their country quickly and were able to push back and fight against the colonizers by defeating, most famously, the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, and they became a colonizer themselves. So the Japanese are a good example of how a country could resist colonizers by co-opting the technology and the systems they brought. The authors also give another example here of how Ethiopia played Russia off against other European powers to build up their own military to the point where they were able to resist the Italians when they tried to colonize them. So these are two examples of the form of resistance called co-option. The next form of resistance, which was the most common form of resistance, was military resistance. So this is right here. And the point that the authors make is this form of resistance, fighting against the oppressors, happened almost everywhere around the world in some form of the or other. People always fought back when the imperial powers tried to colonize them. The example they give is specifically the Philippines, who, after the United States took over the Philippines, fought a war of independence in 1899. So they talk about that in detail here, and they talk about how the Filipinos are eventually going to lose that war. The Americans are only going to lose a little over 4,000 soldiers, but the Filipinos are going to lose 16,000 soldiers. Almost more importantly, though, is the fact that there are estimates that up to 200,000 civilian Filipinos may have died as a result of starvation and disease at this time from fighting back against the Americans. So that the point that the authors make is that usually military resistance was not overly successful. And that oftentimes the consequences for the people fighting back were very severe, especially for the civilians. So that's the key point to take away from that section of the article. The next thing they talk about is that many colonized people resisted using what they refer to as mysticism, right there. Now, they define that as turning to traditional spiritual practices to try and fight back against the colonizers. They give examples of the ghost dance in the United States and other places like the Boxer Rebellion in China. And these were largely unsuccessful, trying to use traditional methods to, say, make your fighters more fierce or maybe resistant to bullets, etc. In general, unfortunately, they did not work very well for the locals. I think the question that I'd wonder about is, how did this, after the lack of success on the battlefield, did that undermine people's belief in traditional practices? Or maybe did it just change them? Maybe did it actually make them stronger? I'm not sure. That's a question I would have about that. And then the last form of rebellion, a very important one that they talk about here, is political resistance. So for them, political resistance, or the way that they will describe it, is often the people that are being colonized start developing a sense of their own identity as a nation. So they are being dominated, say, by European nations, England, France, Germany, or the United States, or the nation of Japan. And a lot of these colonized people start believing, hey, we have the right to be a nation too. We need to organize ourselves politically to resist. And the example that the authors go into great detail is again India. So India, as we know, has been colonized by the British, um, and they point to two leading nationalists of the India in India, Bal Tilak and Mohandas Gandhi, who really encouraged Indians to start thinking of themselves as essentially equal, if not superior, to the British in terms as a culture and a heritage, and for that reason had every right to be their own modern nation. So they start developing this sense of nationhood within the people of India. And then in the next few paragraphs, they then start describing how they also fought back economically. And that is, they encouraged people to stop buying things the British were selling in India. Most famously, they told them to stop buying clothes and things made out of cotton. And Gandhi very famously started weaving his own clothes made out of cotton so that he wouldn't buy anything from the British. So as we learned before, the British are taking the cotton from India, they're making cloth and clothes out of it back in England, and then they're forcing the Indians to buy it back from them. And by boycotting this, the Indians are putting economic pressure on England and hurting them that way. So this is an example of how one nation did not fight back militarily as much, but pushed back politically and economically. And eventually, this is very important, the modern state of India is born out of this resistance. And so this is an example of how these patterns of imperial colonization and resistance against them kind of create those create the world we know today, the countries in their modern form as we understand them. So, okay, I hope that wasn't too much to throw at you. I hope that summary was somewhat helpful in getting your head around these ideas. In short, in your answer to number 2, you really want to speak to all 4 forms of resistance: co-option, military resistance, mysticism, and political and economic resistance. Speak to those 4 things. That will give you a solid handle on how people were fighting back against colonialism at that time. Awesome. Okay. Question 3. So this one's kind of tricky because, I'm asking you to think about, what were the impacts that colonialism had on the people that were colonized? I mean, what would it mean to have a foreign group of people come to your land and demand that you act differently? If you fought back violently with force, maybe you or somebody you loved would have died. Um, and, if it wasn't successful, what would that have done for your spirit? If you decided to work with the oppressors, maybe the result was you would have been successful and found an opportunity to maybe grow and figure out how to make money and be successful in this new environment. Maybe you learned new languages. Maybe if you were in India, you learned English and you learned to become successful within that society. Maybe at some point you and your family might actually move to England, which many Indians eventually do. But what does that do to you as an individual? How does that make you view yourself and your role within your society? And how does that change your view of your culture? So again, think about those things: self, culture, society. How do individuals, in resisting this new reality being brought to them from the outside, how do they change in those 3 categories? So that question is challenging. And that's the one I'm going to throw out there for you that you have to think on to a bit. The point that the authors make is it's it's pretty general. It's like, yeah, changes happened. Couldn't not change. colonization and imperialism affected everyone in one shape or form. Um, so you guys are going to have to think about that one. I'm going to be really interested to see what you have to write. A really interesting lens to view this subject is through language. Where do people speak different languages and why? Why is my friend from Somalia also speaks Italian? And the fact that he speaks Italian, how does that how does that affect his view of himself and his culture and the larger Somali society and their history of being, colonized by Italy at one point? Those kinds of questions can really help you understand the world we live in today. Okay, so know this has been a lot of random stuff pretty quick. I appreciate your patience as always. We're working through this whole learning from home model. Um, just once again, your only work for this week was to complete the answers we just went over in these two videos, to get them back to me. You know how to do it, and then that's it. We're heading into our long weekend, so I hope you really enjoy it. Take some time to hopefully take a walk outside, nicely distanced from other people, but enjoying some of the sun and our lovely skies right now at this time of year. We are truly fortunate for the weather we have going on, and we will get together on Monday, 2 o'clock in office hours, to talk about this stuff. Don't give up on history, guys. I am committed to making it as dull as possible throughout the year. That's my commitment to you. But if you stick with it, promise, you will get something from it. So at any rate, can't wait to see you all. Miss you. We'll be talking to you soon. Take care.